That's good, and you guys came out with some really important information that part of me wants to kind of follow up on that. But there's another piece I want to throw in here, and really, the name of this series is really movement building, and one of the things that we've been trying to pay attention to give both attention to and have an intentional conversation around is this idea of social movements. And one of the things that that from our conversations, the three of us, have talked a lot about, that there's some really exciting things happening in environmental justice right now that have kind of pre-social movement characteristics. And we talked about those. I even actually wrote those down, if you remember. As far as social movements, if we think of the 60s, we think about the labor movements, those sort of things that captivated a whole society into focused work. And some of the things we talked about really was this social movements having a collective identity. So we all know what it is. Intentional and sustained action, something that doesn't just happen over time. It doesn't happen just once in this moment, but actually happens over a length of time. And actually this idea of kind of work and the meaning, the meaning of, like, say, in this case, environmental justice being changing. So it isn't, and again, one of the things you guys both talked about is the inequities, and I guess one of the things that I've been really interested in is how we've been shifting the needle, moving from a conversation of just disparities, so it's not just those people in that neighborhood. I mean, because to be honest, who cares? If I don't live in that neighborhood, I mean, that's really where the not in my neighborhood mentality came up. If it's not in my neighborhood, I don't really care. So why should I care about communities that I don't live in, or that people that don't look like me? So I mean, I guess that's one of the questions I'm asking about it. In this sense of movement building, how do you think we're doing with this question of disparities and how we're framing the issue around, how we're talking about the issue, so it isn't just really kind of ghettoized environmentalism? Just throw it out there. I don't know.
Wow. Okay. That.
Sorry, that wasn't on the little thing I said we might talk about.
That's a lot. Let me see. How shall I answer that? I guess I would say, I'm going to say a number of things. I think several things, give me hope for where I see the movement. Movement going lately. I would say, the conflicts that we've seen historically between EJ movement, activists and organizations, and mainstream, largely white, male, middle class dominated heterosexist organizations continue. And I think that movement, and I'm a part of both movements, the mainstream movement has not actually learned those lessons, and I defy anyone here to tell me otherwise. That continues to be a major conflict. Aside from that, we continue to see, of course, the citing inequities, the quote-unquote traditional issues of environmental injustice, environmental racism, environmental inequity, continue not only forward, but in fact intensifying. We saw in 2005, I believe it was, 2007, the 20th anniversary of the toxic waste and race study done by the United Church of Christ, which was the first national study that actually created an algorithm, a formula to actually statistically, spatially determine where is the hazardous waste going in the United States of America. And using all these variables, education, income, class, blah, 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 race. Turns out race was the strongest predictor of where a hazardous waste facility would be placed in the United States in the 1980s. Well, 2007 turns out that those relationships, that statistical relationship, is actually intensified. It's actually gotten worse. So for anybody who's worried about, let's move beyond some of the traditional issues, well, we can't do that until we've actually dealt with those traditional issues of the drastic, violent spatial inequities, the way how we deal with our waste and pollution. The other thing, of course, that has changed over that time is that people have begun to pay more attention, of course, to the role of refugee, migrant, immigrant, and indigenous communities. And we sort of moved beyond that old black-white binary that's still actually a problem, and I think in a lot of mainstream policy discourse. And it turns out, contrary to notions, very simplistic and naive notions of assimilation, that these groups continue to be the targets and living with an enormous amount of pollution and toxic waste. So newcomers, second and third generation, continue to face these problems. Where I've seen hope and I think some success and really productive movement is around, and Shalini, of course, is the real expert on this, a number of things. Food justice, I think, has really been important. People have begun moving into this question of, okay, how do we deal with food islands, food deserts, the lack of healthy, sustainable, affordable, organic, nutritious food in working class communities of color, poor communities. How do we move beyond simply just sort of blaming agriculture producers and doing something? And so I think a lot of us are aware that people around the world, certainly around this country, are producing food for themselves, for their neighbors, for their families, for each other. And I think that's really productive because people are no longer depending on the large agricultural conglomerates, no longer depending on government to solve those problems. So any of the people who are interested in anarchy and autonomy, I'm with you. I think those are productive movements forward. Shalini, of course, is the real expert also on the issue of climate justice. And for me, that's, I think, one of the places where I've seen the most productive critiques of the problem and moving forward to the solution. People in the climate justice movement, where EJ meets climate justice or climate change, have been largely unafraid to talk about some of the root causes, have been largely unafraid to say maybe a market-based system, maybe a capitalist system isn't actually meeting our needs. Maybe that's actually one of the roots of the problems. Maybe if we're going to talk about a solution, maybe we need to move beyond that. Maybe we need to dismantle capitalism. Or any system that is rooted in the domination of humans over the environment and the domination of certain humans over others. That's a really productive thing that I almost never saw become sort of at the mainstream of the discourse in EJ in the 80s and the 90s. Now, you can look at the principles, the 17 principles of the environmental justice movement, and find that kind of language. But I would argue that the EJ movement, at least in the United States, has largely moved away from those radical and transformative principles. That is until, I think, really people began to embrace food justice and climate justice. So, and I think when we talk about that, people then begin to realize that, as Shalini talked about, David, as you talked about, there's the flip side of environmental injustice, the flip side of environmental racism, the flip side of that violence that communities are confronting every day is the privilege, is the ability, the unearned right, apparently, for many communities to live in relatively unpolluted spaces, for many communities to be able to walk along the beaches that aren't littered, to have access to a beach, to have access to green spaces, to parks, to museums, to clean air and water, et cetera. These things that so many people, the majority of the world's peoples, don't take for granted. So the flip side of environmental injustice is the environmental privilege that I think we need to make that link, that the two don't just somehow coexist, but they're actually related, that environmental racism, environmental injustice is, in fact, intimately related and facilitates environmental privilege and vice versa. So I like to get us, in some ways, out of the ghetto, out of the barrio, out of the hood, off the res, and say, let's go to these places, these spaces of privilege where people are living high on the hog, and ask, what's the problem with that? Maybe that's part of the root, and we need to attack that. We need to dismantle that, problematize that. Because I do think that's at the root of the problem. And so I'm seeing and hearing and feeling that vibe in the movement more than I ever have. And to me, that's been really productive and exciting.